On the night of the 4th of March, 1942, a massive shadow passed over the Pacific Ocean. Two enormous aircraft, each 4 engines roaring, had traveled 2,400 miles from the Marshall Islands in a single bound. Their target was Pearl Harbor. Their nation was Japan. And one of these aircraft would prove to be the finest flying boat ever built, a machine the Western world would largely forget. The Kawanishi H-8K Emily. That was its Allied code name. The Japanese called it something else. But by the time this story ended, American pilots would have a new fear, because the best flying boat of the Second World War was not British, it was not American, it was Japanese. And this is how it happened. The story begins not with this daring raid, but earlier, on a different date, the 1st of January 1941. At the Kawanishi Aircraft Works in Kobe, engineers were working on something ambitious. The Japanese Navy needed a replacement for an earlier flying boat, the H-6K, which had become outclassed. The new aircraft had to be faster, more heavily armed, and able to fly farther than anything the Allies were building. The Navy issued a specification. The engineers listened. They built what many historians today consider the greatest flying boat of the entire war. The design was straightforward in concept but revolutionary in execution. 4 Mitsubishi Kasei engines, each producing 1,850 horsepower, would push a hull the size of a small airliner across the open ocean. The fuselage was over 94 feet long. The wingspan stretched 125 feet. Armor plating protected the crew. Self-sealing fuel tanks meant that a direct hit would not mean instant destruction. The designers thought of everything. 6 separate fuel tanks in the fans, wings, and lower hull. Ammunition storage distributed so that one explosion would not doom the entire aircraft. The airframe itself was sleek and modern, a design that would not have looked out of place a decade later. On the 31st of December, 1940, the prototype took its maiden flight. The aircraft rose into the sky. The pilots felt something new. This machine moved. It moved with a power and grace that surprised them. But there was a problem. During high speed, taxiing on water, the hull became unstable. It wanted to nose down. The engineers solved this in a way that showed their precision. They increased the depth of the hull by 1 foot, 7 3/4 inches, a small change. But on the test flights that followed, the aircraft transformed. The instability vanished. The H-8K became what it was meant to be. So, by late 1941, the modified aircraft was approved for production. The designation was H-8K-1 Navy Type 2 Flying Boat Model 11. The engine was the Mitsubishi Mk4B Kasei 12. The armament was 2 20mm autocannons and 4 7.7mm machine guns. The range was 4,470 miles. The speed was 269 miles per hour. These numbers told a story, a very different story from what the Allies expected. Here is where the underestimation begins. In 1942, the Western powers had their own flying boats. The Americans had the PBY Catalina, a sturdy, reliable aircraft that was slower and less heavily armed. The British had the Sunderland, famous and powerful, but even the Sunderland could not match what Japan had created. Nobody in the West knew yet, but they would learn. They would learn in a way they did not expect. On the 4th of March, 1942, 2 H-8K-1 flying boats took off from Kwajalein, atoll in the Marshall Islands. They were armed not with bombs to drop on ships, but with bomb racks to carry weapons over an enormous distance. The pilots refueled from a submarine that had taken position at the French frigate Shoals. And then they flew toward Hawaii. They flew 2,400 miles across open ocean. The American raid on Pearl Harbor had happened 4 months earlier. Japan wanted to strike back. It was audacious. It was desperate. And it was possible only because of what Japan had built. The H-8K reached Hawaii over Pearl Harbor on a night when American defenses were on alert. The aircraft released its ordnance. The bombs fell on the naval base. Fires were set. Ships were damaged. But the real significance of this moment was not the bombs. It was Palm. The proof. A Japanese flying boat had flown 2,400 miles, conducted bombing raid, and had the range to return home. The Allies had nothing like this. Nothing, even close. But there was more to come. The H-8K that followed into production was the H-8K-2, the variant that would become legendary. The engineers had listened to the combat reports. They had heard what pilots needed. The H-8K-2 had 5 20mm cannons instead of 2. It had 3 7.7mm machine guns instead of 4. The engines were upgraded to the Mitsubishi Mk4Q Kase 22, more powerful, more reliable. Some H-8K-2 variants were fitted with ASV radar, allowing the crew to detect aircraft and ships in darkness and fog. By any measure, it was the most formidable flying boat to enter service during the war. 167 H-8K flying boats were built in total. The first entered service in 1942. By 1943, they were being encountered regularly in the Pacific. The reactions from Allied pilots were consistent. They said the same thing again and again. This aircraft was almost impossible to shoot down. In 1943, an American pilot encounter with an H-8K that was running a Plassen patrol mission over the Solomon Islands tells the story. The American pilots were experienced. They had shot down dozens of Japanese aircraft. But this flying boat was different. Their rounds seemed to disappear into the fuselage. The armor plating was absorbing everything. The self-sealing fuel tanks meant that hits that should have caused fires did not. The aircraft climbed away, damaged butane tact, and made it home. The American pilots filed their report with a new respect. This aircraft was the hardest Japanese plane to shoot down that they had encountered. The reputation grew. The H-8K became known not just for its range and firepower, but for its toughness. Pilots called it a flying tank. The nickname was not flattery. It was fear, dressed as respect. By 1944, the H-8K was being used for long-range reconnaissance missions over vast stretches of ocean. The Japanese Navy needed to know what the Americans were doing. The H-8K could fly out for 2,000 miles, turn around, and come home. It could spend hours over the ocean, watching, reporting, and when it was attacked, which happened often, it could usually fight its way out. The aircraft had become indispensable. The turning point of this story comes not from a single battle, but from a pattern of defeats. One after another, American pilots reported encounters with the H-8K. One after another, the aircraft survived, damaged, sometimes crippled, but still flying, still making it home. This was when the realization set in. The Western world had been out-engineered. Japan had built something superior, Noten theory. In fact, in the sky, where it mattered most. The vindication of the H-8K came from an unexpected source. When Japan surrendered on the 15th of August, 1945, one H-8K-2 survived the war intact. It was at Takuma, Japan, when the Americans arrived. The aircraft was confiscated, shipped to America, and evaluated. The American engineers examined every inch of the design: the armor, the fuel systems, the engines, the frame, and what they found confirmed what the pilots had been reporting. This was a brilliantly designed aircraft. The Japanese engineers had understood something that the Western designers were still learning. How, unquote, to build an aircraft that could survive combat, how to armor it without making it too heavy, how to seal the fuel tanks so that bullet holes did not mean disaster. The American teams learned from the H-8K. They took notes. They understood. But by then, the war was over. The H-8K never faced the new generation of Allied fighters that were coming. It never had to prove itself in a battle where the odds were more even. It simply existed. It served. It was superior. And then, as all things from that war have, it faded from memory. Today, nearly 80 years later, the H-8K Emily is overshadowed by more famous aircraft. The Zero is remembered. The Spitfire is remembered. The Mustang is remembered. The Catalina is remembered. But the H-8K, perhaps the finest flying boat ever built, has been largely forgotten. The one surviving aircraft was restored and is now in Japan, but most people have never heard of it. Most people have never even heard the name Emily. And yet it deserves to be remembered, not because it won the war. It did not. Japan lost. End quote. But because it represented the peak of what could be achieved in aircraft design under the constraints of 1942 technology. The H-8K was faster than the Catalina. It was, more heavily armed than the Sunderland. It had better range than any Western flying boat. The engineers who designed it understood something fundamental, that in war, the machine that survives is the machine that wins. And the H-8K survived, damaged, sometimes barely. Booty survived. The story of the Kawanishi H-8K Emily is the story of an underdog that was never supposed to win. Japan was not supposed to build the best aircraft of any type. The Western powers had industrial capacity. They had resources. They had air superiority. Bhutan, one narrow category. In a specific moment in the war, they were out-engineered. A group of Japanese designers and engineers saw a problem. They solved it better than anyone else. The result was an aircraft that Allied pilots respected and feared. An aircraft that to this day remains underappreciated and largely forgotten. But here is the question for you. In a war decided by industrial capacity and manpower, how much did the H-8K matter? If the best flying boat in the world could not change the outcome, what does that tell us about what actually determined the war? And if Japan had the engineering capability to create something this advanced, why did they lose? These are the questions worth asking. These are the conversations worth having. And they are why the H-8K Emily, even in defeat, deserves to be remembered. Not as the weapon that changed the war, but as proof that innovation, regardless of which side it comes from, commands respect. If you think the Kawanishi H-8K Emily should be more famous, or if you think there are other forgotten aircraft from the war that deserve recognition, let me know in the comments. Your thoughts on the forgotten aircraft of history matter. Hit like so YouTube shows this to more people who are interested in real aircraft history, not just the famous names. Next time, we are looking at a machine that Japan designed specifically to hunt American warships in the open ocean, the Yokosuka P-1Y Ryzen, a land-based bomber that was faster than many fighters, and that pilots called suicide. Subscribe so you do not miss the story of the aircraft Japan built when it was running out of time. Thanks for watching.